Thanks very much for coming this evening. As Larry was saying earlier, I'd like to say what an honour it is to talk about some of the ideas which have been developed by Stephanie Kelton, Bernie Sanders' Chief Economic Advisor, and some of her colleagues, in the room where Larry, Bernie's brother, is sitting and to be introduced by Larry Sanders. That's a great thrill. It's also a great thrill to follow Molly Scott Cato and that fascinating talk which we were just learning about. I wasn't aware of the work that Molly had done on sustainable finance through the European Parliament, and it was both interesting and very impressive as well. I would ask you not to judge modern monetary theory based on what I'm going to say over the next 25 minutes or so. I'm not one of the people that developed modern monetary theory, and as you may be aware from me wandering about all over the place and being a little bit clumsy at the moment, for me it's sometime in the middle of the night, because I only arrived from Australia yesterday, and so once I get the adrenaline going, I'm sure we'll be fine. But what I'm asking you to do is to, if I'm introducing you to modern monetary theory today, is to go away and find out a little bit more about it. And I'm going to be presenting you with some ideas which suggest that the way in which we habitually think about the role of the government budget in the economy and about macroeconomic ideas might be flawed, and it might be flawed because it doesn't take into account the way the modern monetary system actually works. I think this is important. It's particularly important if you're campaigning for a progressive policy agenda to get this right, to understand the distinction between a currency issuer and the UK government as a monetary sovereign government is a currency issuer and a currency user. You and I are currency users, and local authorities in this country are currency users. Governments that don't have their own currencies within the Eurozone are currency users. Currency issuers have much more freedom of action and, in a sense, much greater responsibility to use that freedom of action in the public purpose, to pursue a progressive agenda than currency users, as we're going to see. Now, there'll be a few charts in this presentation. Don't get too worried about the charts when we come to them. I have to show them to you, otherwise you're going to think I'm making some of this stuff up. Feel free to retain a high degree of scepticism. I was very sceptical, very negative actually, about modern monetary theory when I first started thinking about these ideas, when they were first presented to me 10 years ago, a bit more than 10 years ago. I've been an academic economist for over 30 years, so I've spent the majority of my career as an orthodox economist, the minority of my career as a modern monetary theorist. But I am, like a reformed smoker, very much obsessed with MMT now and with its implications, as I was mentioning before, for the role of the government budget in the economy in the pursuit of a progressive policy agenda in the public interest. Bernie is pursuing a progressive policy agenda in the public interest. If you go onto his senatorial webpage, you'll see his agenda for America, which, what counts as a progressive agenda, of course, differs from country to country. Different countries have different histories, different set of institutions, but many of the things which you find in those 12 steps forward on that page would apply equally well to the UK. The UK, like the US, has become a very unequal country. In the case of the UK, income inequality increased dramatically in the 1980s, and that increase in inequality has never been reversed. In the UK, as in the US, employment for many people is precarious. There is not full employment. There has not been full employment for over 40 years. There's a high level of underemployment. You have 0 hours contracts. You have people under stress because they don't have enough hours of work, or they can't be sure in the future that they're going to retain their employment opportunities. In the US, obviously, they have slightly different problems as far as the healthcare system is concerned, but in the UK, you have an underfunded, severely under-resourced healthcare system. In the UK, like the US, you don't have free, like Australia as well, you don't have free, well-resourced higher education, and top of Bernie's 12 steps forward in his agenda for America, in the US more so than in the UK. Dramatic action needs to be taken to move towards ecological sustainability and limiting, because you can't reverse, but you need to limit climate change. Major investments need to be made in dealing with these issues. And how you think about the government budget, how you think about how you're going to fund what needs to be done is important. Where will you find the money? Well, here's a couple of famous economists. On the left, we have a picture of Hyman Minsky and a famous quote from one of Hyman Minsky's greatest pieces of work, a book, which was published in 1986. The game of policy making is rigged. The prince is constrained by the theory of his intellectuals. That's what Minsky said. In many respects, orthodox economics is, well, demonstrably wrong, actually, but misleading. One of the ways in which the orthodox approach to thinking about economic policy making is misleading is that orthodox economists, in our view, don't understand the way modern monetary systems actually work. There's a lot of smoke and mirrors. There are a lot of voluntary institutional constraints on how the government carries out and funds its spending agenda in countries like this, which we don't think are broadly understood. And that's Warren Mosley on the right. One of the people, along with Stephanie, one of the four people that developed modern monetary theory over the last 25 years or so. This is quite from him. Lack of understanding of the monetary system has been the worst enemy of the progressive agenda. The person on the left here certainly does not understand the monetary system, in my view. You talk about austerity, I call it living within our means. Do you know what your means are? Your means are the people that you have in this country, their skills, the equipment available to you, the technology available to you, your infrastructure, your natural resources, and most important of all, of course, your ecological space. That's what your means are. Your government is not going to run out of pens. On the right-hand side, just so we can be relatively even about this, we've got a quote from John McDonnell. Let me make it absolutely clear that Labour under Jeremy Corbyn is committed to eliminating the deficit. I'm going to be suggesting that eliminating the government budget deficit in the UK is not a wise move, particularly at this point in time, and indeed the fiscal deficit should be significantly higher than it is at the moment. By trying to eliminate the fiscal deficit, you either drive the economy into a recession, or you drive the private sector, and especially households, further into debt, and there is too much household debt in this country already. As far as the Green Party is concerned, the England and Wales Greens anyway, I've seen signs down the years of a better approach to framing the government budgetary policy, what we call fiscal policy. There's a quote from Caroline Lucas. What worries me about what he said, well, she's talking about George Osborne a couple of years back, is that it does rather unhelpfully reinforce the framing that the deficit is so important that it has to be the number one. Absolutely right. It doesn't go as far as I would go. I'm along with Stephanie Kelton. You can see Stephanie Kelton in the Senate with Bernie himself, and there's a quote from Stephanie Kelton: "I refuse to pay homage to the balanced budget god." Well, so do I. I'll show you why in a minute. There's a quote from Bernie Sanders: "Balancing the budget on the backs of the elderly, the sick, the children, and the poor is not only immoral, it's bad economic policy." Now, there's a couple of diagrams here from a really good book called Diagrams and Dollars by somebody called J.D. Alps. On the left-hand side, you've got a diagram describing the way that most people think the monetary system works. Most people think that FG there stands for federal government. This is from a US book, you need to say CG, here, central government. Most people think that the government gets its money from the private sector, taxing the private sector into poverty. The private sector doesn't have much money in the first place. The government's taking all that taxpayers' money away in taxes. It's also borrowing from the private sector, and it's borrowing from the rest of the world as well. The UK government, if it's not getting the pounds from China, it's getting the pounds from Germany, or it's getting the pounds from Brunei, or somewhere. The UK government, of course, is the sole legal manufacturer of the pound. And once the government's got that money, it's wasting a lot of it on entitlements of one form or another. Or it's wasting it on some form or other of discretionary spending, which it would be better to avoid, so we'd better have a small government so we don't tax ourselves into oblivion or build up debt which is going to be a burden on future generations. And of course we've got to pay interest and we've got to repay the principal, and that's going to be drained too, a burden on future generations again on all that money that's been borrowed in the past. Now that, it may be an innocent fraud for many people, but it's a fraud. Logically, it's not the way in which a modern monetary system works and has to work as far as a government is concerned, which does not borrow in foreign currency, which does not have a fixed exchange rate, which has its own currency and central bank, and which every time it spends in the case of the UK, pounds into the banking system, into the private sector. Now, you can ask me questions about this later. We obviously don't have a huge amount of time at the moment, so I'm going to avoid the voluntary institutional constraints which currently exist in the UK, the smoke and mirrors, which hides the reality of the monetary system. But the reality of the monetary system is what you can see on the right here. The central government is at the top. Every time it spends, it's spending new money. It's not spending your money. It's not your picture that's on a £5 note. After all, the government is spending its own money. So the government spends money. Yes, that money goes into the private sector. What's happening as a result? Well, it's creating all those public goods and all that infrastructure on which your economy depends, and which we all depend in terms of, for example, the health service, the education system. It's creating the circumstances which allow profitable businesses to exist in the economy. Now, some of what is spent into existence is withdrawn from existence again in the form of taxes. Every pound, I should say, so that the government spends is a new pound. Every pound that you pay in taxes destroys a pound. Taxes are not there to pay for government spending. They are there to ensure that the total amount of spending in the economy does not go beyond the productive capacity of the economy and create inflation. They are there to provide a reason for there to be a demand for pounds in the economy, for the pound to retain its purchasing power over time, for it not to be inflated away. What's the right way of thinking about government bonds? About government debt? Why does the government issue bonds at all? Well, I actually wouldn't issue government bonds, but you can argue that government bonds play a useful role in the UK financial system. They provide pension funds and other investors with safe, interest-bearing assets which they can purchase. And prior to the start of quantitative easing in the UK, when the approach to setting the bank rate, the official interest rate changed, they also played a role in facilitating the setting of the official interest rate by the Bank of England. You can ask me about that later if you want. The government does not need to issue bonds to fund itself. The government is the currency issuer. Indeed, the distinction between a government bond and cash is a finer distinction than you might imagine. Cash, government money, is debt for the government. It's an asset for you, it's a financial asset for you if you hold it, it's a financial liability for the government. You can use it to pay taxes or to make other payments that you may be obligated to make to the government. I've got some old £5 notes. I haven't been in the country for a while. I'm going to be paying a trip to the Bank of England sometime next week, and I am going to force the government to repay its debt, or I'm going to force the Bank of England, which after all is wholly owned by the government, invest all of as part of the government, although it has a limited form of independence for some purposes, to repay its debt. How will they repay that debt? Well, you have fiat money, as I've been suggesting before. Your government is not obliged to convert that £5 into gold, or into foreign currency at a fixed rate, or into anything which it can run out of. Your government cannot run out of pounds. No monetary sovereign government, with the exception of Yeltsin's Russia, when it actually didn't need to, has ever defaulted on debt in its own currency across monetary history. Your government can never run out of pounds. So what's the constraint? Well, we're not arguing for the government to spend like a drunken sailor, to use a little bit of conservative sounding language. The constraint is what you can produce. Those are your means in this country. Anything which is available for sale in pounds, the UK government is always in a position to purchase. So if you want a well-funded health system, well, actually what's important is, are there the people with the necessary skills? Is the technology available? Do you have the infrastructure there? Because if these things exist, the government can buy them. I'm about to show you that government surpluses, if you don't have a trade surplus, if you're not Singapore, if you're not China, if you're not Germany, if you're not Norway, are unsustainable. They either drive the economy into recession or they drive the private sector, and in recent years that largely means households further into debt and creates a more fragile financial system. I was just suggesting taxes don't pay for spending. We do need to pay taxes because otherwise there would be too much spending in the economy as a whole and it would be inflationary. But actually the government spends and then it withdraws some of what it has spent in the form of taxation. Imagine if we were starting a new monetary system now. If the pound didn't exist, would the government have to ask you to pay taxes in pounds before it could spend anything? Of course not. There would be no pounds. You wouldn't be able to pay those taxes. The government has to spend pounds into existence before people can pay taxes in them. Your government has a completely different monetary system to Greece or Italy or those countries in the Eurozone, or indeed countries which have managed their exchange rate and built up foreign currency debt. So if we're talking about Argentina or Brazil, they have a different monetary system to the UK. They're not in the same position as the UK is. Just to show you this, here is a chart where we have financial balances going back to the 1770s for the UK government, the UK private sector, and the rest of the world. Now, for every lender in the UK financial system in pounds, there has to be a borrower. If you're a lender, then you're running a financial surplus. So if you're saving over time, if you're accumulating financial assets over time, you're running your own personal surplus. If I'm borrowing, I'm running a deficit. Well, we can add the two of us together. We're both part of the private sector. If we imagine I'm a UK resident for the purpose of this discussion, and if you're running a surplus and I'm running a deficit, we'll cancel out. You can put all households and non-financial businesses and financial businesses in the private sector together, and you can accumulate them all together and come up with a sectoral balance for the whole private sector. And look, if you go back to 1770 in the UK, that's the red line. Where has that red line usually been? Above zero. What does that tell you? It tells you that the UK private sector, over time, down through the centuries, normally net saves. It normally net lends on the financial system. When it net borrows, it's usually a sign that there's a problem around the corner. So we've got the private sector going into substantial deficit in the UK in the late 1980s, just before that big recession of the early 1990s, and again at the end of the 1990s, around about the year 2000. What about the government budget? Where did all this stuff about balancing the budget come from? I can tell you where it came from. It came from basically Gladstone and Disraeli and their colleagues. That's where it all started. You can see across much of the 19th century, that's the black line, the UK government was more or less balancing its budget. Now, how was that possible? After all, for every lender there has to be a borrower, for everybody with a surplus there has to be somebody or some institution with a deficit. The UK government could only balance its budget when the UK private sector was net saving, because the rest of the world was net borrowing. What made that possible? An empire. That's what made that possible. That's why the UK government was able to balance its budget down those years. How come the German government is able to balance its budget at the moment? Largely because other European countries in recent years have tended to be running a trade deficit with Germany. When you look at the foreign balance, by the way, when the foreign balance is below the horizontal axis, that's the blue line here, below zero, that means the UK has been running a trade surplus. The rest of the world has been running a deficit with the UK. In recent years, of course, the UK has had a deficit on its balance of payments. That means the foreign sector has been running a surplus. But there isn't a close relationship, at least in recent times, between what's been happening to the foreign balance and either of the other two balances. You can look over the last few decades, anyway, since the 1970s, at the government balance and the private sector balance in the UK, and you can see they've been negatively correlated with each other. When one goes up, the other goes down. When there's a financial crisis, the private sector gets pessimistic and starts to net save. What happens as a result? Well, people stop spending, of course. What happens as a result? Well, the government ends up running a deficit, either a deliberate deficit in order to support the economy, avoid a big increase in unemployment, avoid a serious recession, or a deficit that they end up running anyway, even though they've been pursuing austerity policies, because, of course, when the economy crashes, their tax receipts crash, and welfare payments increase anyway, and you're forced to run a deficit in any case. And the purpose of this chart, and similar charts to this, when monetary theorists look at these types of charts, is to say, okay, well, I better move on then. But just very quickly, from this chart, the government, if you are going to have an economy which is running close to full employment, your government cannot control. They can influence, but they can't control what the rest of the world is doing on your financial system. The country's trade balance and current account balance. The government cannot control. They can influence, but they can't control the private sector balance. To a considerable extent, the government balance is outside of the control of the government under those circumstances. It's determined within the economy. But to the extent that the government has discretion over its balance, well, historically, the UK government has usually run a deficit. You can see from this chart. They will in the future, as they have in the past. So maybe we should stop talking about running surpluses, because they very rarely run surpluses, and they're not very big when they run them anyway. And well, that's just updating the chart. That's more recent times, and you can see more clearly there the private sector going into big deficit in the late 1980s and the early 2000s, when the government went temporarily into surplus. When the government's running a surplus, it's taxing you more than it's spending. It's taking safe financial assets out of the economy. Now, let me just jump ahead through a few slides. This slide is just pointing out that the level of the government's debt at the moment, that people are terrified of, is actually lower than the average government debt since 1770. This is making the point that government debt is just a supply of safe GB-pound financial assets for the private sector and the rest of the world to hold. The UK government is, has a level of debt far below the level of debt in Japan. It's above the level of debt in Australia. This is household debt in Australia, the UK, Japan and the USA. In Japan, household debt has not been rising over the last 20 years. It's been falling relative to GDP. In Australia, where we have much less government debt than you, we have much more household debt than you. Where is there likely to be a financial crisis? Japan or Australia? Australia is much more vulnerable to a financial crisis than Japan. What does all this mean? In the last 3 or 4 minutes, I want to say something about a job guarantee. It means government deficits are normal and necessary. It means if you're a progressive, you should decide what needs doing and just do it, as far as the economy is concerned. Funding the expenditure is not the issue. If the real resources exist, you can buy them. Rich people's taxes, they don't pay for them. Sure, we want a progressive tax system because we want a more equal society. We want more social justice. The rest of us have got to pay taxes because otherwise there'd be too much spending in the economy. It would be inflationary. But rich people's taxes don't pay for anything. There's no absolute need for the government to issue securities if you lack productive capacity in the economy, and so inflation becomes a problem because of too much spending. That's the time to raise taxes. Now let me just say a word or two about the job guarantee. Just as we flick through some of these other slides, there's not going to be time to talk about income. It turns out when you're looking at life satisfaction or life expectancy or a variety of other measures of well-being internationally, it's not important in rich countries. We shouldn't be thinking about growing the economy for no good reason. GDP is there for a purpose. The growth of the economy and sacrificing people's well-being and security to grow the economy is not a good idea. What is important is reducing income inequality, as this chart shows. Income inequality went up dramatically in the UK in the 1990s. You want to target something? Don't target the government budget, target this. Get income inequality down again in the UK. You can do that through the tax and welfare system. You can also do it by changing institutional arrangements for setting wages, increasing the minimum wage. Unemployment has a severe impact on well-being. This is a study done in Oxford based on a survey covering people in countries with 98% of the world population. Now, we have evidence that unemployment has a severe impact on subjective well-being. It has a severe impact on mental health. And we have evidence that just compensating people for lost income does not make up for the majority of this. It makes up for about a third of it. Employment is important. So, if the government budget will normally be in deficit, and this is where we're going to finish in the next couple of minutes, if the government budget will normally be in deficit, if it's important to reduce income inequality, if it's important to give people secure, well-paid, productive employment for well-being, how would you go about doing that? Well, one of Bernie's policies is a job guarantee. A job guarantee would involve you, if you were unemployed or underemployed, visiting your local job bank and maybe being given the options to work on community projects. You can ask me about this in a few minutes because there isn't time to go through it all now, or environmental projects, or working on small infrastructure projects, or maybe working on public art, or being paid for a while to do writing work or research work. This happened in the New Deal in the US in the 1930s. We are not sure of things for people to do. There are an immense number of needs which are not being met at the moment. Our job guarantee would be funded by the central government. It would be largely administered locally, meeting local needs, so there would be different jobs in different parts of the country. It would be available to everybody. It is not work for the dull. It would be compulsory for no one. Nobody would lose a guaranteed basic income if they didn't choose to participate in the job guarantee. It would be done through the public sector, although there would also potentially be cooperatives involved, but it would not be privatised. It would help to stabilise the economy over time. As the economy boomed, the job guarantee would shrink. Spending on the job guarantee would fall. In a recession, the job guarantee would expand. It would set the level of the deficit. How? Well, the deficit would be at the right level when the last person walked into a job guarantee office and took a job within that job guarantee. It would set minimum wages and conditions for the economy generally. You have a legal minimum wage in this country, but you don't guarantee people employment at that minimum wage. You would not be replacing non-job guaranteed sector jobs. It would nurture participants. There would be training opportunities, education opportunities within the scheme, but they would not be compulsory. You would take people as they were, and you would find useful employment for them to do. It would not be, as some of the pictures on these slides have related to, not be a temporary crisis measure. That picture at the top here is from the temporary partial employment guarantee that was in place in Argentina 10 or 15 years ago. This would be permanent. We would like to permanently abolish involuntary unemployment, and we believe that we can do it. And you would be nurturing not only participants but the environment. We are talking about a green job guarantee here. That's what Bernie wants to do. That's what the campaigning organisation in Australia that I'm associated with, Get Up, wants to do, because a job guarantee and a more even distribution of income and wealth is important for social stability in the future. Ecological sustainability, of course, is overwhelmingly important above everything else. And monetary stability, well, maybe we need to rethink the role of the government budget and how the government balance sheet and private sector balance sheets interact with each other over time, bearing in mind that households are not currency issuers. They can run out of money. They do become insolvent. The UK government, while it doesn't have a fixed exchange rate, while it doesn't have foreign currency debt, cannot and will not be insolvent. Okay, thanks very much.